The heat inside the Millerville bank was a suffocating blanket, thick with the smells of old paper-stale sweat and the metallic tang of coin. Cassidy Flynn wiped a bead of perspiration from his brow, his gaze fixed on the teller counting out the last of his savings. $200. A fortune earned through 3 years of breaking wild land, of mending fences, until his hands were raw of fighting off the crushing loneliness of a ranch carved from the edge of oblivion. It was all for her. For Phoebe. He clutched the worn letter in his pocket, the paper softened by countless readings under the dim glow of his kerosene lamp. He knew the curve of her smile, the light in her eyes, a face etched into his mind by months of solitude and hope. Phoebe Langston, a woman with hair like spun gold and a spirit brave enough to cross an ocean and a continent for a new life. His life. The money was for a new wedding dress, a proper start, a testament that his promise was as solid as the land he worked. "That's it, Mr. Flynn," the teller said, pushing the stack of bills across the polished wood counter. 200. Cassidy carefully folded the notes, his movements deliberate. This was the culmination of everything. In 2 days, Phoebe's stage would arrive in Harmony Creek. In 2 days, his life would finally begin. The bank's double doors swung open with a violent crash that shattered the afternoon quiet. 3 men burst in their faces, obscured by dusty bandanas. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky, held a Colt peacemaker that seemed an extension of his arm. "Nobody move," he snarled, the voice a low, gravelly rasp. "This is a robbery." Panic erupted. A woman screamed. The teller's hands shot into the air. Cassidy instinctively dropped to the floor, pulling an elderly woman down with him as a shot splintered the wood of the ceiling, raining dust and plaster onto their heads. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. He watched from beneath a writing desk as the outlaws moved with brutal efficiency. One vaulted over the counter, stuffing cash into a canvas sack. Another kept his pistol trained on the terrified customers huddled against the far wall. The leader stalked through the room, his boots thudding on the floorboards, radiating an aura of absolute control. He stopped near the woman Cassidy had pulled to safety, his gaze falling on the delicate chain around her neck. "That's a pretty little thing," the outlaw rasped, his voice laced with a cruel amusement. He reached down and with a single sharp tug, ripped the silver locket from her throat. Cassidy's blood ran cold. The locket was small and oval, etched with the design of a climbing rose. It was identical to the one he had sent to Phoebe months ago, a token of his commitment, a piece of his heart sent across the miles. He had spent a month's earnings on it. The woman sobbed as the outlaw pocketed her treasure. But Cassidy felt a different kind of violation, a personal and terrifying dread. It was as if the man had just stolen a piece of his future. The leader's cold eyes swept the room and landed on Cassidy. For a heart-stopping moment, their gazes locked. Cassidy saw no remorse, no hesitation, only a chilling emptiness. The outlaw gave a slight, mocking nod before turning back to his men. Time to go. They were gone as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a wake of shattered nerves and the lingering scent of fear. As people slowly began to stir, Cassidy pushed himself to his feet, his mind reeling. The stolen money felt insignificant. All he could see was that silver locket vanishing into the outlaw's pocket. All he could think was that a man, that ruthless, that predatory, was loose on the same trails Phoebe would be traveling. The hope that had warmed him for months was now tainted with a new icy fear. 2 days later, the sun beat down on the cracked earth of Harmony Creek, bleaching the landscape to bone white and shimmering in the heat. The town was little more than a handful of sun-blasted buildings clinging to life at the edge of an unforgiving wilderness, the air thick with dust and the smell of hot wood. Cassidy stood on the station platform on the same worn letter in his hand, his anxiety a tight knot in his chest. Every approaching cloud of dust on the horizon sent a jolt through him, a mix of fervent hope and the gnawing fear born in the Millerville bank. He scanned the empty planes, imagining Phoebe's stagecoach, praying she had passed through safely, that her own silver locket was still resting securely where it belonged. The distant rumble grew into the familiar clatter of wheels and the thud of hooves. The stagecoach, a dusty red behemoth, materialized from the heat haze and lumbered to a halt. The driver, a leathery man named Jeb, grunted a greeting. Cassidy's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment. The end of loneliness. The beginning of everything. The coach door creaked open. Cassidy held his breath at the image of Phoebe's blonde hair and blue eyes burning in his mind. But the woman who stepped out onto the platform shattered his expectations into 1,000 pieces. She was not Phoebe Langston. She wasn't even close. Her hair was the color of polished jet pulled back in a severe practical knot. Her eyes were dark and almond-shaped, scanning the small gathering with a sharp, careful precision that seemed entirely out of place. She wore a simple dark dress worn from travel, but immaculately clean, a far cry from the hopeful finery he'd imagined. Clutched against her chest, as if it were a shield, was a small lacquered wooden box. She held it with a two-handed grip that spoke of immense value or immense danger. The stagecoach driver tossed a single small bag onto the platform. Papers were a mess, he muttered to no one in particular, then climbed back to his seat without a backward glance. The stage lurched forward, leaving the woman standing perfectly still in a cloud of settling dust. Her gaze moved from face to face, searching, assessing. Cassidy looked from the photograph of Phoebe in his hand to the woman before him. The disappointment was a physical blow, so sharp and sudden, it almost took his breath away. This was all wrong. A terrible, inexplicable mistake. Then her dark eyes found his. She held her ground, her expression unreadable, and held up a piece of paper covered in elegant, swooping characters he couldn't begin to understand. She seemed to be expecting him, as if this impossible situation made perfect sense to her. She stepped closer, her worn boots clicking against the warped wood of the platform. She spoke, her voice clear and melodic, but the words were foreign, each syllable precise and urgent. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake." Cassidy said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The 100 gentle greetings he'd practiced for Phoebe turned to ash in his mouth. Confusion flickered across her features. She looked at the letter in his hand, at Phoebe's smiling face, then back at her own paper. She pointed to herself and said a name that sounded like Leewee. Then she pointed at him, her head tilted in a silent question. Cassidy shook his head slowly. "I'm Cassidy Flynn. I was expecting someone else." He held up Phoebe's picture, a desperate need for this woman to understand the depth of the error. Her eyes, intelligent and quick, studied the photograph. A flicker of understanding, then dawning alarm crossed her face. She reached into her bag and pulled out a different photograph. It showed a man with a thick, graying beard and kind, hopeful eyes. A man Cassidy had never seen before. She showed him the picture, then pointed to herself again, repeating her name with more emphasis. The terrible truth began to settle. 2 people, 2 arrangements, 2 lives now hopelessly tangled. But as he looked at her standing alone on that platform with the vast, empty wilderness at her back, his own disappointment began to fade, replaced by a different concern. Her shoulders sagged slightly as the finality of her situation became clear. Her hands gestured toward the horizon where the stagecoach had vanished, her expression a universal language of despair. Samuel Crow, the proprietor of the general store and the town's unofficial patriarch, emerged onto his porch, wiping his hands on his apron. His weathered face creased into a frown. "Problem, Cassidy. This ain't the German girl you've been expecting." "No, Samuel. It's not." The frustration was a hot coal in Cassidy's chest. "Seems there's been a serious mix-up." Samuel studied the woman with the undisguised suspicion of a man unused to strangers. "Well, she can't stay here. Next stage ain't due for another 2 weeks. The woman Liwi seemed to understand their tone, if not their words. She clutched her wooden box tighter and took a half step back, her body tensing as if preparing for flight. But there was nowhere to run. That's when Cassidy saw it. A dark tear in the sleeve of her dress, and on her bag, a faint reddish-brown stain that looked chillingly familiar. Blood. The sight transported him back to the cold dread of the Millerville bank. The knot of fear in his gut tightened. This wasn't just a mix-up. This was trouble. Real trouble. His frustration evaporated, replaced by a sharp, immediate focus. He stepped closer. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, pointing to her torn sleeve. "Are you hurt?" She followed his gaze, her eyes widening slightly as she touched the fabric. She shook her head in a practiced, almost automatic denial, but her movements were stiff, her expression guarded. She shifted her bag behind her back, but it was too late. He had seen the damage. Samuel's expression darkened. "Cassidy, maybe we should get Doc Miller over here." At the mention of a doctor, genuine alarm flared in Liwi's eyes. She shook her head vigorously, backing away, until her heels hit the edge of the platform. She was more afraid of attention than she was of her own injury. "Easy now," Cassidy said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Nobody's going to force you." Samuel lowered his voice. "Something ain't right here. How does a Chinese woman end up with papers for a German bride, and where in tarnation is your Phoebe?" That was the question Cassidy had been pushing away. If Liwi was here, where was Phoebe? Had her stage been stopped? Had she run into a ruthless man who coveted a silver locket? Liwi seemed to sense the turn in their conversation. She reached into her bag again and produced a bundle of letters tied with string. The address was written in English Pine Ridge Settlement, 100 miles north. She pointed from the letters to herself, then gestured in the direction the stage had gone. Her meaning was clear, a silent, desperate plea for understanding. "Pine Ridge," Samuel muttered, squinting at the letters. "That's Henrik Larsson's place. Been trying to get a mail-order bride for 5 years. Liwi's face lit up with recognition at the name Henrik. But the relief was instantly replaced by a new urgency. She glanced at the sun already beginning its slow descent, and her lips moved in what looked like a silent prayer. Whatever had happened on her journey, whatever had caused that wound and stained her bag, she was running out of time. Cassidy made a decision born of instinct, not logic. He was a man who understood isolation, who knew what it felt like to be alone and at the mercy of a harsh world. He couldn't leave her here. "Samuel," he said, his voice firm. "Ready my wagon. I'm taking her to Pine Ridge." Samuel's eyebrows shot up. "That's a hard day's ride through rough country, Cassidy. You don't even know what you're getting into." "I know I can't leave her here." He was already moving toward his supplies, his mind made up. Liwi watched him, her dark eyes missing nothing. When he gestured toward his sturdy buckboard wagon, she gave a short, decisive nod. As she bent to lift her bag, she winced, her free hand instinctively pressing against her ribs. The movement pulled the fabric of her dress taut, revealing a dark, spreading stain beneath the cloth. The wound was worse than he'd thought. It was fresh, and it was still bleeding. "Ma'am," Cassidy said, stepping closer. He had to be sure. "You're hurt badly." She tried to deny it again, but a wave of dizziness made her knees buckle. Cassidy caught her elbow, feeling a fine tremor run through her. The lacquered box slipped from her grasp. With a gasp, she caught it before it hit the platform, her reflexes born of pure desperation. It rattled the sound of metal or coin shifting inside. Something valuable enough to protect with her last ounce of strength. "Look," Cassidy said, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't know what happened to you on that stagecoach, and you don't have to tell me. But you're hurt. You're in the wrong place. And it'll be dark soon. You can trust me to get you where you need to go, or you can try your luck alone out there." He gestured to the vast empty plain stretching to the horizon. She studied his face for a long, silent moment, searching for something honesty, decency, a reason to trust. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. Just then, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the landscape, fast and urgent. Liwi went rigid. Her face drained of all color as she stared at the approaching dust cloud. She grabbed Cassidy's arm, her grip surprisingly strong, her fingernails digging into his sleeve. She spoke rapidly in her own language, the words sharp, with a terror that needed no translation. 3 riders emerged from the heat, their horses lathered with sweat. The lead rider was a thick-set man with a sheriff's star glinting on his vest. But his posture was all wrong for a lawman, too predatory, too focused. "That's Sheriff Dalton from Copper Creek," Samuel muttered, a note of unease in his voice. "What's he doing this far from his jurisdiction?" Liwi had gone completely still, but her grip on Cassidy's arm tightened. She knew this man. She knew exactly who was coming for her. Sheriff Dalton swung down from his horse, his deputies fanning out to flank the platform. His smile was wide and false, an expression that never reached his cold gray eyes. "Afternoon, folks," he boomed. "We're looking for a woman. Came through on today's stage. Traveling alone, carrying stolen property." His gaze slid past Cassidy and fixed on Liwi. He saw the lacquered box in her arms, and his smile widened with genuine avarice. "What kind of stolen property?" Cassidy asked, keeping his voice level. He instinctively stepped slightly in front of Liwi, shielding her. "A small fortune in gold coins," Dalton said smoothly. "From a bank robbery over in Millerville, 2 days ago." The lie was so audacious, it almost took Cassidy's breath away. He had been at that robbery. The thieves were 3 men, their faces covered. This woman was not one of them. Dalton was using the chaos of a real crime to cover his own. Liwi shook her head frantically, holding up her bundle of letters, trying to show him her legitimate purpose. Dalton waved them away with contempt. "Those are easily forged. What I'm interested in is what's in that chest she's guarding so fiercely." He took a step forward, his hand drifting toward the butt of his pistol. "Step aside, Flynn. A law-abiding citizen like yourself wouldn't want to be obstructing an official investigation, would you? It gets complicated." But it was already complicated. Cassidy's mind was racing, connecting the pieces. Dalton was from Copper Creek, a town miles away. Why would he be investigating a Millerville robbery unless he wasn't investigating it? Unless he was it? The broad-shouldered leader from the bank, the cold gray eyes. It was him. And if he was here for Liwi's chest, it meant her journey had been violent from the start. "You have a warrant?" Sheriff Cassidy asked, his voice low and steady. "Don't need one when the suspect is in plain sight." Dalton's patience was wearing thin. The veneer of civility was cracking. "Funny thing about that robbery," Cassidy said, letting the words hang in the hot, still air. "I was there." Dalton froze. The false smile vanished from his face, replaced by a flicker of pure fury. He had not counted on a witness. "I saw the men who robbed that bank." Cassidy continued, his hand now resting near his own Colt. "And she wasn't one of them. But I'm thinking you were." He looked pointedly at Dalton's broad shoulders, at the cold eyes he now recognized. "And I'm thinking you gave her that knife wound on the stage when you tried to take her property. She fought you off, didn't she? Harder than you expected." Liwi's eyes widened. She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the accusation. She understood that this stranger, this man, who was supposed to be meeting someone else, was defending her. He was speaking the truth for her. Dalton's hand snapped to his gun. Last chance, Flynn. But Liwi was faster. In a stunningly decisive move, she did 2 things at once. She hurled the lacquered box toward Samuel's storefront, sending it skittering across the boards, and simultaneously threw herself off the side of the platform, rolling behind Cassidy's wagon for cover. The lid of the box burst open, scattering a river of gold coins across the dusty planks. Gunfire erupted. A bullet splintered the wood where Cassidy had been standing. He dove behind a water trough as Samuel's rifle cracked from the shadows of his store, pinning one of the deputies. "Give it up," Flynn Dalton roared, taking cover behind a stack of crates. "All this for a woman who ain't even yours." But it was no longer about that. It was about a corrupt lawman preying on the vulnerable, about the haunting image of a stolen locket, and about a quiet, resilient woman who had refused to be a victim. In that moment, protecting her felt more right than anything had in a long time. He risked a glance toward the wagon. Liwi had made herself small behind a wheel, her dark eyes sharp and focused, tracking the deputy's movements. She was a fighter. She caught his eye and shook her head, gesturing toward the scattered gold. "Forget it," the gesture said. "It's not worth dying for." Cassidy knew then that whatever was in that box, it was more than just a dowry. And whatever danger she was in, it was far from over. He chambered around the metallic click a final grim promise in the sudden quiet. The fight for Harmony Creek had just begun. They were trapped out in the open, with the long ride to the ranch seeming like an impossible dream. He settled his sights on the edge of Dalton's crate. He wouldn't let this man take anything else from anyone. The journey to the ranch was a long, silent ordeal, punctuated only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the horses' hooves. They had escaped the station by a miracle of timing, and Samuel's surprisingly accurate rifle fire, which had given them the precious seconds needed to get the wagon moving. Dalton and his men had followed for a time, but Cassidy knew this country. He had taken a winding, treacherous path through a series of rocky arroyos that no sane man would ride through at speed, and the pursuit had fallen back. For now, Liwi sat beside him on the buckboard seat, her posture rigid, the recovered lacquered chest held tightly on her lap. The setting sun painted the vast, empty landscape in strokes of orange and purple. But the beauty was lost on Cassidy. Every shadow looked like a threat, every gust of wind sounded like approaching riders. He had insisted on properly cleaning and dressing the wound on her ribs before they left the relative safety of Samuel's store. It was a clean slice, just as he'd suspected, shallow but long. A knife wound. Dalton had tried to intimidate her, to cut the chest from her grasp, and she had fought him. The knowledge settled in Cassidy's gut like a stone. As darkness fell, a fragile truce formed between them. He offered her his canteen, and she accepted with a quiet nod of thanks. He shared a piece of hardtack from his saddlebag, and she ate it without complaint, her eyes constantly scanning the darkening horizon behind them. They stopped for a few hours under the scant cover of a lonely mesa, allowing the horses to rest. Cassidy built a small, smokeless fire, its flames barely a flicker against the immense star-dusted darkness. "They will come," Liwi said, her first words since the station. Her English was heavily accented, but clear, the sentence constructed with careful thought. "I know," Cassidy replied, looking into the fire. "A man like Dalton doesn't give up. Not when he's been exposed." She watched him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You believe me, not him." It was a statement, but it held a question. "I was in the bank," he said simply. "I saw the man who led the robbery. It was Dalton. He didn't mention the locket." The memory was too raw, too deeply connected to his now shattered hopes for Phoebe. What had happened to her? Was she safe? The question was a constant, painful hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. Liwi seemed to understand his turmoil. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather-bound book. In the flickering light, he saw it wasn't a Bible or a novel. It was a ledger filled with columns of neat, precise characters and numbers. She opened it to a marked page and began to read, her lips moving silently. She wasn't just a bride-to-be. She was educated, methodical. An hour later, as they prepared to move on, she unfolded a map from her belongings. It was a detailed topographical survey of the territory, far more accurate than any Cassidy owned. She traced a route with her finger, her nail stopping at a point just west of his ranch. Water here, she stated, pointing to a tiny, almost invisible symbol. And a pass. Faster than the main trail. Cassidy stared at the map, then at her. How do you know that? I study, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Her knowledge was practical, strategic. Nothing about her fit the profile of a simple mail-order bride. The more he learned, the less he understood. They arrived at his ranch just before dawn. It wasn't much, a small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands, a solid barn and a corral all nestled in a shallow basin that offered some protection from the unrelenting wind. To Cassidy, it was everything. It was home. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering for a moment on her arm. She was trembling not from cold, but from sheer exhaustion. Inside, he lit a lamp, casting a warm golden glow over the simple room. There was a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a single bed in the corner. It was a solitary man's home, and the sudden presence of this mysterious wounded woman felt both strange and profound. He made her sit by the hearth while he stoked the embers from the previous night back to life. He made coffee strong and black and watched as she cradled the warm mug in her hands, her shoulders finally starting to relax. The lacquered chest sat on the floor beside her, a silent testament to the danger they had fled. "You're safe here," he said the words, feeling inadequate. "He won't find us easily." Liwi looked around the small, sparse cabin. She saw the worn books on a shelf, the neatly stacked firewood, the clean but patched quilt on the bed. Her gaze came to rest on his face, and it was filled with a deep, sober consideration. She had been judging him since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach, and now it seemed she had reached a verdict. "Cassidy Flynn," she said, testing his name on her tongue. "You are a good man." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "You saw, not my face. You saw a human, in danger. This is good." She set her coffee mug down and placed her hands on the lacquered chest. "This is not a dowry," she said, her voice dropping lower. The gold was a lie. A cover. Cassidy waited, his heart thudding. The truth was finally coming. She worked the small, intricate latch on the box and lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a false bottom where the gold coins had been, lay several stacks of paper wrapped in oilcloth. They were ledgers like the ones she had been reading, filled with the same meticulous script. "My name is Liwi," she said formally, "and I am a courier. These documents, they are proof." "Proof of what?" "Proof of theft." She answered, her eyes flashing with a cold fire he hadn't seen before. "The Central Pacific Railroad hired thousands of my people. They promised fair wages for blasting tunnels through mountains, for laying track across deserts. Many men died. They worked for promises that were broken." She carefully lifted one of the ledgers. "This is a record. Names. Hours worked. Wages promised. Wages paid." She tapped a column of numbers. "The difference is the money the railroad stole. Enough to make a handful of men in San Francisco rich beyond measure." The sheer scale of it was staggering. This wasn't about one woman's savings. This was about justice for thousands. Her perilous journey, the fake identity, the gold, it was all a brilliant, dangerous ruse to transport this explosive truth. "Dalton wasn't after your dowry," Cassidy said, the pieces clicking into place. "He was hired to stop you, to get these ledgers." "Yes," Liwi confirmed. "The railroad has spies everywhere. They must have learned someone was carrying proof. They hired Dalton because he is a greedy man with a badge. The bank robbery was his idea, a way to justify seizing my property and killing me if necessary, with the law on his side." Suddenly, the wind outside began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the window panes. The sky, which had been clear at dawn, was now a bruised, sickly yellow. A sandstorm was coming. A bad one. Cassidy went to the door and looked out. The air was thick with dust, the horizon already obscured. They were isolated, cut off. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "He knows this country too," Cassidy said, turning back to her. "He knows a storm like this pins a man down." Liwi was already on her feet, her expression calm and determined. The fear she had shown at the station was gone, replaced by the resolve of a soldier. "Then he will come here," she said. "He will use the storm for cover." Cassidy bolted the door and moved to the rifle rack above the fireplace. He took down his Winchester, its wooden stock smooth and familiar in his hands. He passed a second rifle, a smaller Spencer carbine, to Liwi. She took it without hesitation, checking the action with an experienced efficiency that told him she had handled a firearm before. The small, safe cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. Outside, the wind screamed like a banshee, and the first grains of sand began to scour the walls of the house. Dalton was coming, and this time there was nowhere left to run. The fight wouldn't be for gold or for justice. It would be for their lives. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a roaring, blinding chaos. The sandstorm hit with the force of a physical blow, a howling monster of wind and grit that clawed at the walls and shrieked down the chimney. Dust, fine as flowers, seeped through every crack, coating every surface in a gritty film and making the air thick and hard to breathe. The light from the single lamp was a feeble beacon in the swirling gloom. Cassidy checked the loads in his Winchester for the third time, his knuckles white. He and Liwi had barricaded the door with a heavy table and pushed the bed against the single shuttering window. The cabin, once his sanctuary, had become a fortress, and a fragile one at that. Liwi moved with a quiet, focused grace, her fear channeled into preparation. She had found a spot near the hearth low to the ground where the Spencer carbine rested across her knees. Her gaze was fixed on the door, her breathing slow and even. She was no trembling bride. She was a warrior waiting for a battle she knew was inevitable. "He will try the barn first," Cassidy said, his voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "Look for the horses. See if we're still here. He will not expect us to be ready." Liwi replied, her voice calm. Hours passed. The storm was a timeless entity, its fury relentless. Inside the cabin, the tension was a living thing coiling tighter with every passing minute. Every creak of the straining wood, every rattle of the window sounded like an approaching footstep. Then, through a momentary lull in the wind, came a different sound. A sharp crack followed by the splintering of wood. It came from the direction of the barn. "He's here," Cassidy breathed. They took their positions, Cassidy near the door, Liwi by the hearth covering the window. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the storm itself. They were being watched, measured. Dalton was taking his time, using the storm as his ally. A voice cut through the wind, amplified by the strange acoustics of the storm. "Flynn, I know you're in there." It was Dalton. His voice a mocking shout. "And I know you've got the woman with you. Send her out with the ledgers and I might just let you live." Cassidy remained silent, his rifle steady. "Don't be a fool, Flynn." The voice came again, closer this time. "This isn't your fight. This is about business." A bullet slammed into the door, punching a hole through the thick wood and burying itself in the opposite wall. Liwi didn't flinch. "He is testing us," she whispered. Suddenly, Dalton's tone changed, becoming venomous and personal. "You know, I remember your father, Flynn, a real pillar of the community. A man who knew how to take what he wanted." The words were laced with a deep, old bitterness. Cassidy felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What do you know about my father?" he shouted back against his better judgment. A cruel laugh answered him, carried on the wind. "I know he ruined my family, old man Dalton. That was my father. We had the parcel of land just north of here. During the great drought, your father came to us full of sympathy. Offered to buy our land for pennies on the dollar, just to help us out. He bled us dry, Flynn. He built this ranch on my family's misery. Now I'm going to take the one thing you have left to hope for." The revelation hit Cassidy with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just business. This was a vendetta. Dalton's hatred wasn't just for the railroad or Lewy. It was for him, for the name Flynn, for a grievance that had festered for years. Another shot tore through the window, shattering the remaining glass. Sand and wind blasted into the room. "He is trying to draw our fire." Lewy said, her voice sharp. "To know our positions. They had to do something. They couldn't just wait to be picked off." Cassidy's mind raced, searching for an advantage. He knew every inch of this cabin, every loose floorboard, every weak spot in the wall. He looked at the hearth. The fire was nearly out, smothered by the sand. But the chimney, the barn, he said to Lewy, an idea taking shape. "The hayloft is full of dry tinder. If I can create a diversion, draw them over there." "It is too dangerous," she countered. "The storm. You will not see them." "That's the point," he said. "They won't see me either." He crawled to the back of the cabin, to a small root cellar door hidden beneath a rug. "Stay here. No matter what you hear, do not open that door until I get back." She looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a fierce light. She gave a single sharp nod. "Trust." He slipped into the cellar, the earthy smell of damp soil, a stark contrast to the dust-filled air above. He navigated the short tunnel that led out to a woodpile a few yards behind the cabin, a route designed for restocking firewood in winter, not for escaping a siege. He emerged into the heart of the storm. The wind tore at him, the sand stinging his face like 1,000 tiny needles. Visibility was less than 5 feet. The world was a screaming, brown nightmare. He moved on pure instinct, keeping the wall of the cabin at his back, his rifle held tight against his chest. He could hear Dalton and his men shouting to each other, their voices distorted and swallowed by the wind. They were moving, circling the house, closing in. He had to be fast. He reached the barn, the big doors groaning on their hinges. Inside it was a cathedral of shadows and swirling dust. He climbed the ladder to the hayloft, his heart pounding. He pulled out a small oilcloth packet from his pocket, containing flint steel and a small bundle of oil-soaked rags. Just as he was about to strike a spark, a floorboard creaked below him. He froze. A dark figure moved through the gloom, one of Dalton's deputies. Cassidy flattened himself in the hay, barely daring to breathe. The deputy walked directly beneath the loft, his pistol drawn, and exited through the back of the barn. Cassidy let out a slow, shaky breath. He struck the flint. A spark caught. The rag smoldered, then burst into a small, hungry flame. He tossed it into the driest part of the hay. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a wisp of smoke followed by a flicker of orange. The fire caught with terrifying speed, devouring the dry hay, roaring to life. Thick, acrid smoke filled the barn. He scrambled down the ladder just as shouts erupted from outside. The diversion was working. Fire in the barn. Cassidy slipped out the back door and hugged the wall, making his way back toward the cabin. The orange glow from the burning barn cast eerie, dancing shadows through the sandstorm. He saw 2 figures, Dalton and a deputy, running toward the flames, silhouetted against the blaze. But where was the third man? He reached the woodpile and was about to enter the cellar tunnel when a figure loomed out of the swirling dust directly in front of him. It was the other deputy left behind to guard the house. The man's eyes widened in shock. He raised his pistol. A shot cracked sharp and close. Not from Cassidy's rifle. The deputy crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Lewy stood in the doorway of the cabin, the Spencer carbine still smoking in her hands. She had disobeyed his order. She had saved his life. The door was not safe, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Suddenly, Dalton appeared out of the storm, his face a mask of demonic fury lit by the flames of the burning barn. He had realized the fire was a trick. He raised his revolver, aiming directly at Lewy. Cassidy didn't think. He acted. He launched himself at Lewy, tackling her back into the cabin just as Dalton's gun fired. The bullet tore through the space where she had been standing, embedding itself in the doorframe. They sprawled on the floor as Dalton charged through the doorway, his eyes wild. "It ends now, Flynn," he roared. But he had made a fatal mistake. By entering the cabin, he had brought the fight into their space. Cassidy kicked out, sweeping Dalton's legs from under him. The big man crashed to the floor, his gun skittering into a dark corner. Cassidy was on him in an instant, but Dalton was brutally strong. He rolled, throwing Cassidy off, and scrambled for his lost weapon. Liwi was there first. She scooped up the revolver and leveled it at him. Dalton froze, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. He had been outmaneuvered, outfought, and ultimately defeated, not just by the son of the man he hated, but by the woman he had dismissed as a helpless victim. "It is over," Sheriff Liwi said, her voice ringing with cold authority. The fury drained from Dalton's face, replaced by a sullen, bitter acceptance. The storm still raged outside, but inside the small, damaged cabin, a profound silence had fallen. The siege was broken. The storm died with the dawn. It receded as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnaturally quiet. The rising sun cast long, gentle fingers of light across a landscape, transformed the earth a smooth, rippled canvas of reddish-brown sand. Cassidy's barn was a blackened, smoldering ruin, a stark monument to the night's violence. Inside the cabin, the air was still thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder. Dalton and his surviving deputy were bound securely to chairs, their expressions sullen and defeated. Liwi was tending to a shallow graze on Cassidy's arm, her touch gentle but efficient. The shared ordeal had forged a bond between them, deeper than words, a partnership born of fire and trust. In the profound silence of the post-storm world, a new sound emerged, the slow, steady plod of a single horse. Cassidy and Liwi exchanged a look of alarm. He took up his rifle and moved to the shattered doorway, his body tense. A lone rider approached, not with the urgency of an attacker, but with the weary persistence of a long-distance traveler. As he drew closer, Cassidy saw that he was a Chinese man, dressed in simple, durable clothing, his face etched with concern. Liwi let out a small gasp beside him. "Chen Wei," she breathed. "My brother." The man Chen Wei dismounted and rushed to his sister, speaking in a torrent of relieved Chinese. He embraced her, his eyes scanning her for injuries, before turning to Cassidy with a look of profound gratitude. "You are Cassidy Flynn," he said in clear-accented English. "My sister sent a message with a passing freighter 2 days ago about what happened at the station. I came as fast as I could. He was not a savior arriving in the nick of time, but a backup, a contingency plan. It was further proof of the incredible foresight and planning behind Liwi's mission." Chen Wei's gaze fell on the bound lawman, his expression hardening. "Sheriff Dalton," he said, the name a curse. "Your crimes are at an end. We will see that you and the proof of your corruption are delivered to the federal marshal in Denver." His brother's arrival seemed to finally allow Liwi to release the immense strain she had been under. She leaned against the doorframe, a deep weariness in her eyes. Her mission was safe, but far from over. Chen Wei reached into his saddlebag and produced a sealed envelope. "This is for you, Mr. Flynn. It was given to me in Harmony Creek by Samuel Crow. It arrived on a special mail dispatch yesterday." Cassidy took the letter, his hands numb. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, and unfamiliar. He broke the seal. The letter was from Phoebe Langston. Her stagecoach, she wrote, had been stopped by a road closure outside of Millerville. A roadblock Dalton had likely set up in his attempt to intercept Liwi. The delay had been fortuitous. During her wait in a nearby town, she had been offered a position as a governess for a wealthy family, a role that offered security and immediacy that a life on a remote ranch could not. "I must release you from your promise," she wrote. "I hope you understand and find the happiness you deserve. Yours, Phoebe." It was over. The hope he had clung to for so long was gone. but strangely, it didn't hurt. The phantom of Phoebe, the woman in the letters, had been replaced by the real tangible presence of the woman standing beside him. He felt not loss, but a quiet, profound sense of release. He was free. With the immediate danger past, a decision had to be made. Liwi's wound needed time to heal properly, but her documents needed to get to Denver. "I will go," Chen Wei said. "You will be safer traveling with me when you are recovered, sister." Liwi shook her head. She looked from her brother to Cassidy, then back to the precious ledgers. She spoke quietly to Chen Wei in their native tongue, a short, decisive conversation. Her brother nodded, then turned to Cassidy. "My sister is a good judge of character," he said, a small smile touching his lips. "She proposes a risk. She will make a copy of the most critical pages. You will take the copy to Denver. She will remain here to heal and bring the original ledgers when she is strong. The railroad will not know we have divided our proof. It is our best chance." To be entrusted with such a task was a greater measure of faith than Cassidy had ever known. "I'll do it," he said without hesitation. Liwi smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that transformed her face. "I know," she said. A few days later, Chen Wei departed with his prisoners, leaving the ranch in a state of quiet peace. The storm had passed, and the villains were gone, and a new uncertain future stretched before them. Cassidy and Liwi worked together, clearing the debris, mending what could be mended. They spoke little, but a comfortable understanding grew between them. On the morning of his departure for Denver, Cassidy stood on the porch, his horse saddled and ready. Liwi handed him the oilcloth-wrapped packet of copied documents. Their hands touched, and a current passed between them, warm and undeniable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small velvet pouch he had been carrying for months. Inside was the silver locket, the one he had bought for Phoebe, the twin, to the one Dalton had stolen in the bank. He had held on to it as a symbol of a future he had planned. Now it meant something else entirely. He held it out to Liwi. The morning sun glinted off the silver, the climbing rose design seeming to catch the light. "I thought this was for my future," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I was wrong." He looked into her dark, intelligent eyes. "It's for the woman who showed me what a future is worth fighting for." Liwi's breath caught. She looked from the locket to his face, and in her eyes he saw not the dutiful acceptance of a bride, but the clear-eyed choice of a partner. She took the locket and allowed him to fasten the delicate chain around her neck. It rested against her skin, a perfect gleaming promise. She stepped closer, raising a hand to his cheek. "I find right person," she whispered, in wrong place. He covered her hand with his own, feeling the warmth of a beginning, not an end. They stood together on the porch, the rising sun warming their faces, watching the light spread over the calm, clean landscape. The past was a closed book. The future was an open trail, and for the first time, Cassidy Flynn was not afraid to walk it.